I was born and raised in the inner city of Philadelphia, specifically in North Philadelphia, and I was fortunate to have really great parents, but my mother died when I was very young, and I was raised primarily by a single-parent father. My father was born in South in the year 1900, and he was born at a time when education wasn't made available to black children, and so he was a self-taught person. He came north and made a life for himself, but he always understood the injustice that was associated with society in the South. And of course, as I grew up, I was born in 1954, which was the year the Brown versus Board of Education decision was set out by the Supreme Court of the United States. And I grew up during the tumultuous 1960s, and the civil rights movement was a big part of that. And that was the typical dinner time discussion that we had. You know, when I went to college, I actually was a chemistry major at first. But very early on, I started to do some reading about the civil rights movement. And popularly, people think about the civil rights movement in terms of the role of people like Dr. King and those people who had sit-ins, and that was really important. But what I learned is that that movement actually began many years earlier with a brave band of lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall, who went into courts around the South and fought for and received court orders, actually slowly dismantling the institution of separate but equal. And I got very inspired by the story of those lawyers. And I ended up going to law school. I actually went to Harvard Law School, although I got over the whole Harvard Law School thing very quickly. But while I was at Harvard Law School, I think I learned, again, the central role that lawyers play in providing justice to people who can't afford justice otherwise. Because we all go to law school, I think, fundamentally thinking that we're going to help people. And fortunately for me, there were people in my law firm and in my life who reminded me of the importance of lawyers in terms of the institution of justice.
When I was a lawyer starting out at Drinker, Ken was a young partner, already a leader of the firm. He was always a great example to the other lawyers at the firm because there are not that many lawyers like Ken who, at any given time, when he was practicing here, Ken always had open cases that were pro bono cases. I was a very junior associate, and a memo came around the firm asking if anyone would be interested in getting involved in representing a client on death row in Alabama.
So Seamus and I had this great idea that we might work on this case, but we clearly needed adult supervision. And Ken obviously had already known to us a great reputation for working on all kinds of pro bono matters.
They were both new associates, and they sort of shamed me into taking the case because they thought we should do it. I took the case. I went down to Alabama. I met Bo in the penitentiary, and we were able to start litigating the case from that point on.
We were fish out of water, kind of my cousin Vinny, but it was amazing to watch him, the way he handled both the courts, our opponents, just everything with such amazing grace and skill.
Bo was on death row. He had been originally arrested in the mid-1970s, and he had been convicted of capital murder for murdering a grocery store clerk in connection with a robbery. So at that point, he'd been on death row a little over 10 years when we first got involved in the case.
I mean, this was a guy who had been through 2 trials and had been convicted in both. And we had to go through, records, 10-year-old records of trials that had occurred.
Bo's trial had taken place before the United States Supreme Court had decided the Batson decision, which limits prosecutors' ability to strike jurors based on race. Bo's case was still on active appeal, so direct appeal, when Batson was decided, which meant Batson was applicable to his case.
Ultimately, we had to go out into the Alabama community and find the jurors who had been struck by the prosecution in order to demonstrate what ultimately was what got us relief in the case, which was that the prosecution had systematically excluded black jurors from participation in the trial.
His name is James Willie Cochran. His friends call him Bo, and he's one of the few people you'll ever run into who can say that he lived on death row and lived to tell about it. He was convicted for a 1976 murder during the commission of a robbery, but it took him 2 full decades to prove that he never fired a shot.
And in the end, because Mr. Cochran was in fact ultimately granted habeas corpus and then subsequently acquitted, I can say it was the greatest accomplishment I ever had as a lawyer.
I can remember Ken cross-examining the gentleman who was then the elected district attorney of Birmingham, who had been a line prosecutor at the time Bo was first convicted. I think at the end of the day, what freed Bo was Ken's ability to look that lawyer in the eye and just sort of ask him directly whether he took race into account in selecting the jurors in the trial. I mean, that lawyer wasn't able to look Ken in the eye and lie.
I think that for our society to actually have a death penalty, whether you are for or against it as a matter of abolition and ethics and morality, I think it would require of our system of government a precision that the current machinery of death is incapable of providing. You would want to ensure, for example, that indigent people who could be faced with a sentence of death were provided the best counsel. You would want to make sure that those people had access to the best forensic experts. None of that's true in our system. People get justice, unfortunately, in this country, sometimes in proportion to their ability to pay.
Wherever Ken goes in the world, and it's a worldwide reach of Merck's, he sees deprivation and unfairness and injustice, and he's moved inevitably to try to do something about it. We've been very fortunate that in the legal assistance world, he's been moved to advocate for a stronger program, an expanded program, more legal assistance, and at the same time, a much more energetic and robust role for pro bono assistance from corporations and the private sector generally.
Pro bono and access to justice work are vital to our nation, our communities, and to the millions and millions of people who cannot afford legal representation. Merck has one of the oldest and most substantial corporate pro bono programs in the country. It began with the pioneering work of Ken's predecessor as general counsel, Mary McDonald. Ken built on that foundation from the very beginning of his time at Merck.
Ken was the natural successor to take that original program and grow it and expand it, given his passion for the area, his expertise, and his experience. Our lawyers and staff are very active locally in the communities where we live and where Merck does business. But we also look around if anybody in the department has a passion that they care about and want to get involved in, we find ways to support them. So we provide opportunities, again, in the community through existing organizations like Legal Services of New Jersey.
Ken has had the opportunity to serve the ends of equal justice from so many angles. You know, as a trial lawyer, as an outside lawyer here, but then as somebody that is sort of serving as general counsel, now CEO of a company that itself can do so much for the world, that the fact that he's been able to do it in the courtroom and in the boardroom is just something to admire.
Again, I had fabulous parents, and I think that they impressed upon me that everybody was deserving of being treated with respect and dignity. And I think that's increasingly important in our society because we're now a very divided, polarized society, and we don't know people who think differently from us. And therefore we fear them, we disrespect them, we don't care about them. And I think that's really important when you think about legal services, because the clientele of legal services are often the dispossessed. They're typically people who aren't able to hire lawyers to represent their point of view in the courts. We know that on the criminal side, going back to Gideon, people have a right to counsel in criminal proceedings. But in civil proceedings, often what's at stake is almost as important as one's liberty, right? You know, people can be placed in a mental assignment. They can have their children taken away from them. They can have their house taken away from them. These are really fundamental issues. And so I think legal services is critical. And I think it's really important as we as a society try to decide what we're going to do with scarce resources, that we remember how important it is for us to provide the first principle of government, which is legal representation and equal access to the courts, because justice is a fundamental principle upon which our entire democracy resides. And I think it's important. Someone once said, "Thou shalt not ration justice," and I think that's a very powerful commandment that we have to live by.